everyone. Hello, welcome. My name's Helga Henry, for those of you who don't know me, and welcome to this webinar called Not to Fit In, but to Flourish. It's going to share some findings of a piece of research that I did that was funded by the CLAW Leadership Programme. I'd just like to welcome you all today. I can see on the participants, we've got a number of people from leadership programs that I've run with my colleague Lara Ratnaraja. She's here today to help us just put some information in on the chat. Some people from Henley, where I've just recently gotten a postgraduate certificate. We talk about some of this research. I'm really delighted to have a number of people on our panel. They include my academic supervisor for this work, Professor Helen Higson, OBEDL. Helen, hello, she's here to join us. We also have a coach, development specialist working across a number of sectors, Tosin Falope. Tosin, hiya, lovely to see you. And my interest in this topic started when I co-wrote a book, Networkability, Building Your Business One Relationship at a Time. And my co-author and friend and colleague, Andy Bass, is here as well. Andy, hi. Hello. Helen, I'm going to keep you here while we just have a little talk about the first part of this work, which is I sort of came to you. It's over a year ago now, but I came to you with this idea of wanting to look at coaching and social capital, and I didn't know it. And in fact, we'll have a filmed insert from another speaker who couldn't make it today, Anissa Moridadi, of Beat Freaks, and she introduced us. So there's lots of loops here. We'll talk about some connections later on as well. But I didn't know it, but this actually coincided with three very active parts of your life. I knew that you had recently qualified as a coach, and so that's what attracted me. But perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, of course. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I hope you can hear me. The three parts of my life are the fact that in my day job, I'm a professor at Aston Business School. But part of my exciting out of work life is I have the honor and privilege to chair the Icon Gallery. If you haven't been there recently, please go. And then the third part was the fact that during lockdown, I invested in myself, and since then have worked as an executive coach. And here was someone who came to see me to ask me to bring these three together. So it was a delight.
Thank you. Sorry, just while I've omitted to mention one little bit of housekeeping, which is that as well as the services of our marvelous producer Gareth, who I'll talk about later, we also have today Maria O'Brien with us, and she will be doing a live caption throughout the event. I normally do this because I think the button is, there's a CC button, which if you press normally on that bit of the border at the bottom, you can either get it as scrolling subtitles like they do on the telly, or you can get a complete transcript. But yeah, both of those options available to you if you wish. So when we discussed about my basic idea, which was to look at how coaching enabled leaders who were in the CLAW leadership program, how it enabled leaders to build social capital. And we're going to have a little bit of a video in a couple of minutes that are going to explain some key terms about that. Social capital has a particular meaning. I knew it from a book called Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, and as a sort of the networks, resources, relationships that one could use bluntly as leverage. But you, delightfully, I don't know whether to thank you or not for this. I think on balance, I should really thank you. But you introduced me to the work of Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, quite the most dense things I've read in a long time. but what was it particularly about Bourdieu that you thought would be, I mean, I think it's turned out to be really appropriate, but what was your instinct initially?
Well, I suppose that I observed at the start that you were very practiced at discussing the practitioner literature. You were probably more versed in that than I was, but I wanted to push you to read something really difficult, because I thought that if you didn't look at this really seminal work in the space, notably Pierre Bourdieu, you would be missing out on a whole lot of richness when you came to look at your collecting your data. And Bourdieu has influenced the discussion of habitus, which I know you're going to come back to, and the development of social capital in a way that no other writer has done. And I'm sorry it was difficult, but I was very impressed with your grasp of this literature. And I don't think we could have got to where you're going to present today without that struggle. And I think we're still friends.
No, 100%. It's well, I'm hoping that I'll be very interested to see what people's reactions are when they've sort of grappled a little bit with this material themselves. Rather than, I'm going to run through, I have a brief presentation in a moment that's going to run through key bits of the research. The whole thing is available now on the CLAW website. The edited highlights have been available for a while. And maybe some of you had a chance to look at that before the webinar, but if you haven't, that's really fine. New readers can start here. But before we get to that, there was it's literally about 2-3 minute video that's a cartoon, to be honest, which I think if I had watched at the beginning might have really helped me. But Gareth, can you, just 3 minutes, a brief video that's going to present some of the main aspects of the technical bits of this sociological theory that we're going to run through tonight. So I'm going to hand over to Gareth to tee that up.
Let's say that we have here the individual, and the individual enters into society, and society consists of a number of spaces. Society is a multi-dimensional space consisting of a number of subspaces or fields, and these could be any number of different contexts like institutions, social groups, workplaces. And while entering these spaces or fields, the individual always has with him or her the habitus. And the habitus are the resources, the combination of the amount and type of capital that the individual has. And this capital might be economic, money and such, or it can be social capital, like who you know and your networks, or it can be cultural capital, which is very important in Bourdieu's theory, having to do with knowing the right cultural codes, how to behave, and what works in various settings and contexts or in various fields. So all these forms of capital, economic, social, cultural, are transformed into symbolic capital, and that's an automatic process, and it happens when the individual enters into a field. So each field has its own rules or doxa. So the doxa are the rules for the field or space, and according to those rules, the social group at an aggregated level will evaluate the individual and ascribe him or her their position, their legitimate position in the field. So this means that when you study mentoring, it's very easy to identify spaces or fields like these and to analyse them in terms of practice. So studying social practice, what people do, for example, in a mentoring scenario, will make it possible to observe things that kind of that we can then conceptualize in terms of habitus, capital, field, doxa, and so on.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, person on the internet who made that video. It's amazing. I've just seen the link to the we can pop the link on to the animation on as well. I can do that right now. But to move to my research, I'm just going to run you through briefly using some slides, which Gareth is going to move on for me from bit to bit. Now that you've got some of the sort of basic vocabulary in front of you. So Gareth, if we can get the slides up. Yeah, so first of all, this was a funded piece of research, CLAW research, CLAW leadership. I was a CLAW fellow in 2008 to 2010, and normally that research window is only open for 2 years immediately after you do your fellowship. But for the 20th anniversary, it was open to everybody, and I applied. So the stages in the research, moving on, were supervised by Helen, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I did some desk research. That's when, Helen gave me my difficult reading, and I looked at things around leadership, around coaching, around developing diverse leaders, and we'll come to a couple of key concepts from my research in a moment, and read about what the bits of the literature people had written about that. Now, of course, a lot of people have mostly written about leadership and management not in the cultural sector, but just in management and leadership generally. But there was a lot about developing diversity and developing diverse leaders. So in my case, the field was the cultural sector, because that's the one I know about. It's where the interview subjects were going to come from. We designed the questions in the interview based on some of the key things that came out of the skills and the identified attributes from the research. And if you look at the full research, you get to how I got to those questions. Ethical sign-off. I put this in because it was a university-led supervised thing. We got ethical sign-off from Aston University. It took ages, but it did mean that we'd absolutely thought about the emotional labor, the confidentiality, and the security of the information that we were keeping. So the interviews, which I thought were the heart of it and mostly what I did, didn't happen for several months, but that happened over the summer. And then they were analysed using both sort of literally by reading and highlighting, but also some software, which Helen will talk about a little bit. And that's, I'd written up my first half, the literature review part, again, top tip from Helen to do that, so that I just had my analysis to wrap up in the last couple of months. So yeah, so moving on, some key definitions are the words, next slide, minoritized, social capital, habitus, and field. And you've just seen the little film. I'll go into it a little bit more, but I was interested in looking at leaders who had been minoritized. And moving to the next slide, that itself was quite hard to find a definition for. I've sort of seen it used in various things, but in the end, I did, and it's been used predominantly within a race context, in an anti-racism way, recognizing that individuals have been minoritized through social processes of power and domination, rather than just their minority in number, or there aren't, there is a majority. It looks at those social processes of power that mean that people are minoritized, not in a minority. And so that I extended to work across a number of protected characteristics, especially disability, but also race, gender, sexuality. So I talk about minoritized individuals, and some of that we unpacked some of that in the interviews. Next up, social capital. This is Pierre at his the sum of resources that accrue to an individual or by a group by having a durable network of institutionalized relationships, of mutual acquaintance and recognition. So basically he's saying that you can have lots of relationships, but the value isn't so much about how many of them that you have, but how many you can leverage into different sorts of advantage. And then we get to habitus. So getting my head around this idea took a while, really, but this sort of subjective but not individual system of structures, schemes of perception, conception, and action. So basically, all these influences that you have, your upbringing, your socioeconomic sector, your formal education, and environmental stimuli, they all produce what he called an embodied self, a socially produced self. And this influences the way that you interact with the world in the present through conscious and unconscious choices. So I'm going to just give you a little taste of how difficult Bourdieu is. He says that they are structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. And what that actually, I think that means is, these things aren't just a simple conditioning that you get as a child and then mechanically reproduce as you get older. It's more like acquiring a grammar of your mother tongue. You get a way that you behave, a way that you react to things, and that once you've got those in, you create like an infinity of sentences. So you don't repeat the same sentence over and over again. And therefore, what they do is they influence your practices in the social world as you go through life. So he says that this is powerfully generative. In other words, it's a structured structure. It's something that you learn and have and acquire because it's produced by socialization. But then it's a structuring structure. It goes on and generates an infinity of new practices. And I think that's a really interesting thing to get your head around. Although we're going to give that a minute to sink in as we move on to the next slide. And it gets a bit easier from here. Next slide. The field is just the organizations, institutions, and industries which are structured around various combinations of capital and power. And in this case, it was the art sector. Moving on, so then you get this framework between habitus, social capital, and field. I'm gonna leave this on to read, but what I'm just going to sort of explain is that what you get when you're working with minoritized people is that they may have a series of, they have their habitus, they have their background. They also have very specific things that they've learned along the way by virtue of that background. And the field, the institutions may consider those opportunities as a deficit, a lack of capital. So the cultural sector may believe that there's a relative lack of capital amongst certain groups of people. So they're excluded from opportunities for capital acquisition, particularly early on in their career. And then that's compounded because that lack of status, or then impedes people's ability to acquire valued capital, that human capital or social capital. And that means that their next generation of people from that background are similarly disadvantaged, that they inherit dispositions that are more similar to their parents, and the cycle of exclusion continues. And so I think this explains in some reasons why so many of these leadership programs, so many diverse leadership programs, go so far but not far enough, because they never really dismantle the systems that replicate themselves enough. So next slide. Who did I talk to? 5 women, 3 men. These are all how they declared on their monitoring forms. 4 were straight and 4 were gay and bisexual. 3 considered themselves disabled over both social and medical models. They had a range of faiths and beliefs, and all were English or British. Next slide. They were the minority of them if you look at the pie chart, move on, Kara. Minority were white English, and we had mixed white and Black Caribbean, Indian and Black Caribbean participants. So I'm just really going to race through the next bit, which is just the stuff I found but at this point, and I think we have a couple of interviews. Obviously, they're anonymous, and the content was confidential. But I just the participants, because they were so generous with their insights. But we one of the things that was really clear was that the cultural sector, is a very challenging terrain to enter. If you go onto the big report, we've got lots of quotes, but I'm just going to pick out a key quote from each of them. Dipping their toe in, it's kind of like walking into a pub where everyone knows each other. Just that sense of that closed shop. But actually, once you are in the field, next slide, it got difficult and challenging to work in there too, for a number of reasons. Part of it was about it's a closed shop that thinks it's an open shop, the worst. People being competitive with each other because resources were scarce. Everyone's fighting for their own bit. And that within that resource constrained place, that people were making sacrifices, and the size of those sacrifices, particularly in their well-being, was felt problematic to the participants. We then started to talk about habitus and to see it possibly as the route to really embracing people's authenticity. And this is where the impact of the coaching really started to show through. Somebody saying that they embraced their disability, that in their work in dance, they were not fussed about being, what people thought of them or to reach out. And they always had that attitude of be human first, roles second. Another participant spoke really movingly about their upbringing with parents who couldn't read or write, who didn't read bedtime stories, who couldn't help with homework, and actually this person's own academic achievements were very low. They left with hardly any qualifications. But what they did have from their habitus was an amazing sense of relational abilities. And it's those relational abilities that went on to make this person really brilliant at building connections, which moves us on to social capital. There's lots in the report, but basically there's lots of things about the different skills people raised. But what coaching seemed to do in particular was for people to work out what they did and didn't want to talk about, show, or trade in terms of those connections. So next slide. People working out, where are the areas where you stop being authentic or stop feeling comfortable, and that you don't have to go there. Being in control of your narrative and being really clear on what your values are, that allowed you to relax into relationships and grow the ones that worked for you. So the more I was just me, the better those relationships, that social capital, became. There's also a big emphasis on peer support and aligning yourselves with people with similar values. So I love I really love this. There's a real joy in being able to share confidential, strategic, incredibly difficult issues with somebody. Have a glass of wine, some cheesy Wotsits. Yeah, it's absolutely a key part. There was a big discussion in the research about posited by Ibram X. Kendi's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He talks about the duality, fitting in, assimilation, or segregation. Assimilating to the majority status quo, or segregating, putting yourself only amongst your own. But it seemed to me that actually both of those were both of those were some form of fitting in. They both were types of fitting in, and that fitting in versus standing out was something different. One respondent said, I wanted to be on Claude because I wanted to be assimilated. I wanted part of that pie. But it was that through doing Claude and having coaching that you realized you didn't have to be, that you could go about this in a different way. And I think that became the bit of not fitting in, was that authenticity, and that Habitus could help you do that. Next slide. There were some really lovely things about what people did once they got that sense of authenticity. They talked about standing out, on being and having spoken about their own situation, that made space for other people to do that, to say, this is me, and this is me, and this is me, and dancing through life. They gained a greater understanding that what I saw as a background or a way of being that didn't fit in was exactly what was needed. Where coaching really made a difference in terms of people's ambitions was that it stretched people's sense of possibility for themselves. One person in particular, I would never have thought about going for a job like this if it wasn't for my coach. What we identified was, what are the things that drove you? What are your values? And it was this whole thing about making a difference, finding a job with purpose. It wasn't about status and climbing that greasy pole. So yeah, absolutely. This became a really key theme, that actually often people went in thinking they wanted one thing, and as a result of the experience, realizing they wanted something else. So in terms of recommendations, this was carried out very hard on the heels of me qualifying to be a coach. I did the postgraduate certificate of executive coaching at Henley Business School. And some of the things I wanted to work on there was ensuring that as a coach, I found the essence of what people were talking about, not just the presenting issue, the thing that people have come up with. I'd like to work on my, time management, my vision, my strategy, my whatever, but to get to the essence of that. Or, I have a recurring issue with line management. Whatever the issue is, what's underneath that? What's the essential one? I'm very interested personally in what's known as a psychodynamic approach, which, while not being therapy, spends a little bit of time thinking about not just the here and now and the future, but also seeing how your past might have had an influence on that. And that's where Habitus, I think, is a really, really key thing to consider. Not because we're going to poke around in your psyche and, endlessly revel in details of in the minutiae of your childhood. But when I spoke to people about Habitus, people grasped the concept very quickly. They could very quickly think about some of the major influences that have shaped some of their thinking now. And that seemed to me to be a good way into finding patterns and making, as I said, the invisible visible. Some of the things that people are reacting to that they don't even know why they're doing. And finally, a massive thing is to consider the systems at play. To consider, when you're coaching, the power dialectic between yourself and your coachee. To consider when particularly somebody from a minoritized background is working in a space, and particularly if that's a majority space, what other systems and power attributes and other people's habitus might be at play. And so just before to close, I think the other thing that the thing that really came out was on the next slide. Somebody actually asked me, well, do you mind me asking, do you have a protected characteristic? And about 20 minutes later, me going, yeah, we came up with, it's complicated. And what became really apparent was, on all of these monitoring forms, we're asked to tick these boxes. And really, the box you tick is not the life you've lived. I tick a box because I am half Asian and half white. And so if you go to the next slide, I consider my habit to be, sorry, you can move on, Gareth. I consider myself to be Brummie, Irish and Catholic. These are the icons of my upbringing. Birmingham's been, the more I think about it, it's been an enormously important part of my life. I deliberately have put Mrs. Doyle from Father Ted there because that's that's a little, for those of you who aren't Catholic, that's a little infant of Prague, a little statuette we had in our dining room for the whole time I was growing up. They've been really pivotal forces to shape my life. On a lighter note, though, just to end, I should say that I used to have this dinner party game back when I had dinner parties, so that dates it anyway, 1990 probably, where I got guests to imagine or be able to nominate who would they have to be their mother and father. And I always hoped that, next slide, I always hoped that I was somehow secretly the impossible child of Prince and KD Lang. And I think that would have been really a fantastic habitus to have had as well. So in conclusion, what I found was, assimilating or segregating, actually the third way was to be best sum up with a quote that in order to open the door to people like me, I had to be like me. I had not like somebody else. To allow that value of diversity with a genuine belief in a wider range of people doing as much as they can, that coincidentally being me was a great way to do that. And so that's that's a real canter through some of the research. But again, I just want to thank Helen for pointing in the right direction of some of this thinking, but really the participants who gave us so much to think about. So moving on, thank you. Can I invite Helen back in and we'll just have a little chance to talk about that. Helen, just to just so in the first place, just to get your reaction to the research in terms of how you felt and maybe a little bit more about some of that system.
Yes, so I think the first thing is that I think you reach deeper places in the research than I had expected. The participants were so open. We're discussing such deep things that I think we both reached a place that we hadn't expected to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And although it had been a painful process, particularly you referred to the ethical approval. If you haven't experienced ethical approval at either a hospital or a university, I wouldn't try it if I were you. But
well, I wasn't taking. Anyone think I was taking liver tissue for sampling?
I know. But it does mean that we have a very, very legitimized set of data that you can use in this sort of fora, but also that we can write from and that you can use later on. And I while it was a painful process, I don't think you would have been able to ask some of the questions you were able to ask in the way that you were, and also that you were able to give the participants a real sense of comfort and around the conversations you were having with them, which perhaps if you'd said, if you didn't have that bit at the beginning where you said, well, this is confidential and I've been through all this ethical approval, they might not have been so open.
Yeah, I think that's right. And interestingly, a couple of participants have said that they'd done some other claw research where that hadn't been quite so rigorous. So yeah, and I think, yes, I should probably say that the 8 interviews generated, I think, 180 pages of transcript. Obviously, some of that's me, but yeah. So I mean, we've just scratched the surface here and looked at this particular question, but there is other stuff that could be looked at. Just in terms of, I think one of the things we said when we first got the data back was that it really did paint quite a bleak picture of working in the arts. Did anything resonate from you? Because I know you've also been very active in looking at the attainment gap in universities and some work around diversity amongst students. And but were there any resonances for you in the university sector?
Oh, yes, definitely. So in the university sector, we've been working on what has commonly been called social mobility for many years. And indeed, our funding is often linked to it. And there's been lots of work about the deficit model of come to a university and we'll tell you how to do it. Particularly, I did some work earlier in my career around international students who would bring their own habitats and then come and pay large amounts of money to study in the UK environment. Well, things have completely changed now. That we don't regard those students coming to university as having a deficit and learning and teaching them how it should really be done. We actually learn from them.
Yeah.
And I think your findings around your authentic self, but our responsibility, both as a coach and as an educator, is to help people to find their own way, to be able to maximize their own authenticity and to thrive in that way. And I think that things have changed enormously in higher education because of that.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, Anissa Moradadi was a student of yours and then a client of mine. And when I was looking for my academic supervisor, I asked her to get in touch with both of us to put us into touch with one another. And I had invited her to be a panelist on our for tonight's discussion. And she couldn't be with us, but in true Oscar-winning style, she's actually prepared a short film with some of her reactions to what we're going to talk about. And so we're going to, we've got that as a sort of short filmed insert now, before we move on to talking about some of these aspects with the wider panel. It's also going to enable our fabulous live captioner to have a break. So this is automatically captioned, and I'm not just saying anything, but you will see the difference between the two of them. But Gareth, if you can just roll. So Anissa responding to some of those questions. It'll be about 10 minutes.
Hi, I'm Anissa Moradadi. I'm a social entrepreneur and I start and grow purpose-driven businesses, both my own and supporting other people with theirs as a non-executive and a coach. I'm also really lucky to get to be a trustee of Claw Leadership, coming up to the end of my 3-year tenure there. And I'm a public speaker. I share my thoughts, musings, provocations, and experiences as a leader, as an entrepreneur, and as an expert in Generation Z and millennials. So I'm really excited to contribute today to this event. And I'd just like to kick off by congratulating Helga and Helen on a really interesting, insightful, and useful piece of research. Something which resonated with me across my work, both as an entrepreneur and supporting other people as a coach and a non-exec director as well, touched on many of the themes that I'm seeing come up across sector. I found the research really resonant, both as a coach that supports individuals, so artists, creatives, leaders, to explore issues that they're facing at the moment in order to move forward and achieve the things that they want to achieve. I found it really helpful to articulate some of the practices that I think intuitively I've been bringing in because of my own personal experiences and understanding of how I need and want to be supported as a young brown woman in business. So I think what was really helpful was this concept of, I guess, lens. So how our habitus, how the ways in which we behave and we have our experiences shape our values, how that impacts the way that we view issues that we're faced with at that present time. So as a coach, I really, enjoyed that, the quote around looking at the real issue and not just the presenting issue. And I think I'd push that even further and say the ways in which we view issues, the ways in which we're encouraged and told is acceptable to view and talk and approach issues, how does that help us to tackle the present issue? Which I think is really tying in this thought of the habitus and how our experiences influence the way in which we show up. So I think I found that really helpful as a coach to find words for the practice that I'm trying to develop. And I think there's some thoughts in there about how I could sort of push and take that further and maybe even explain that better to the coachees so that they're aware of what we're doing. But I think also for myself as a young entrepreneur, I started my first business at 15. The company that I now own and run, Beat Freaks, has been going for 10 years, and I started that fresh out of university. And I think my own experiences in growing that to a 7-figure business that's employed many people, we've won a lot of awards for our work, and we've got to work with some of the biggest brands and institutions in the world. I absolutely resonate with the idea of utilising social capital in order to put myself in the position where I could, play at the table, be it have a seat at the table or play with the main figures. I think what was really interesting for me was understanding this idea of, the balance of needing to fit in. And I would also say, I think what it touched on was this really hard balance of how do you fit in but also stand out? And I think that is something that Gen Z talk about a lot and are battling a lot, which is this want and desire for collectivism. They need to approach the world's biggest issues, our personal issues, together as a united front, but also the need to stand out and how the world is pushing us to stand out and be extraordinary. And I think this research really talked about how difficult that is actually, that a way of doing that is to own your own authentic story and all the ways in which you're special and magical and unique, but find a way to translate that. And it talks about obviously building a personal narrative, how that narrative can fit into a societal structure. And I think that's something that really resonated with me. I was building social capital by working in communities, building my peer support group, which again the research talks about. I think I was doing that, building up this unique social capital actually, and then I found a way of translating that, trading that if you like, or utilising it in order for me to play at a different table. And use that capital in order to get into a different network, so with funders, with brands that would pay us to do work, etc. So I think what's really interesting is this idea that in terms of, I guess, social mobility, that building social capital and the skill of using that and translating that and playing with that in the right spaces is a really, really powerful tool for individuals, for leaders. So I think I found that really, really helpful and really interesting to think about. I found the bit of the research about our embodied learning and our innate strengths as superpowers really interesting, because I think this asset-based approach to the things that we're often minoritized for being something that is our strength, that our unique, rich life experiences being different to the mainstream is something that is valuable and can contribute in a really, really positive way rather than something you need to explain away. I think that's a really powerful narrative, and I think something that supports people's individual acceptance of themselves and where they're starting at and where they want to go. I think that's really important. But I would also caution, this is a personal opinion, around the concept of our differences being superpowers, because I think it also plays into this needing to be extraordinary narrative, and this is where that conflict between fitting in and standing out, I think, really comes into play. So I think having a much more integrated approach to say these are factors that are of me and in me and shape the way that I view the world. They build my imaginary, they build my perspective, and that influences how I show up, how I relate, how I contribute, I think is much more powerful, because it's then not something that can be taken away or destroyed, or needs to be golden in a way that it can't be messy. And I think adding some humanity, humanizing the concept of our experiences is just a really, really important one. I think, again, one of the participants in our research on Gen Z had said, young people want to be seen as humans and not machines in the workplace. And I think that's just really, really important. And again, I think coaching can help us to work through this kind of dilemma of fitting in and standing out. And I think the middle ground, the balance of that, is actually authenticity. It's saying, as Brene Brown says, we belong to ourselves first. And when I do that, these are the ways in which I can play into the wider group. I can contribute, I can be comfortable in the things that I have to add. I have so much hope for the future. I mean, I am notoriously an optimist. I have hope and I have confidence in the future. But I think also, having been on the Claw board through a really interesting period, right? The last 3 years, sort of post-COVID, the influence of, through COVID and post, seeing how leadership and work and the social contract between employers, employees and leadership, how that dynamic is shifting, and also for us as a board, how we're acknowledging how the dynamic needs to shift between the board, the team, and the participants, the Claw Fellows. I think I'm just so encouraged by the depth of conversation that is happening, and this research, again, is really sort of showing the ability and the need to have conversations about our lived experiences, our habitus, and how they influence the ways in which we show up. And I think I'm really encouraged by, I guess, the rooms in which that is getting to. I mean, Claw is world class. I'm allowed to say that. It's world class in its leadership development, and to know how much we interrogate and sit in those spaces of where dynamics need to change, how our practices need to change, I think is just so exciting and so encouraging, even though it's not perfect and it's not exactly how we would all want it to be. To know that progress is happening, I think, is really, really encouraging. I think the last thing I think I'd like to contribute to this, and I think my overarching contribution to this, is really the tension between fitting in and standing out. And I think Helga's provocation around flourishing is a really, really powerful word, actually, because it encapsulates a lot of that philosophy I was talking about, being able to become, to unfold and to evolve in a way that feels really authentic and natural to that individual person. I think I would say what's really important in our coaching practices and in our leadership development is that we do encourage people to not fit in, actually. And I think, one of the biggest paradigm shifts we can make is away from assimilation as a meaningful way of being successful. I think there is a saying which is, if you're going to let someone down, make sure it's not yourself. And I think this is something that I encourage a lot with my coachees and myself, and again in my leadership practice, working with my own teams. Is a hard balance, but I think really encouraging people to have that dialogue, that respect and that accountability with themselves, where they see that they are an important actor in their lives, and don't let themselves down. I think belonging to yourself first gives you such a solid practice in ways to show up in relation to other people at work, personally, etc. So I think the best way of not fitting in is to fit in with yourself first, and that ultimately means you know you're coming from a practice of showing up truly and authentically and meaningfully in any space.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Anissa for that. There's lots in there. The Brené Brown, I wasn't aware of the Brené Brown stuff, but it absolutely chimes in with the stuff we've been talking about in terms of the authenticity and the habitus. And now I'd like to bring on all of our panelists to have a more to have a response to in the last half hour. I've got some questions, but I'd like to hear first of all from Helen as well. Perhaps all four of us can be on the screen. I've realized also, I think I'm on a little bit of a lag. So sometimes when I say things, they may have already happened on the screen. So apologies for that. Tosin, I'm going to go to you first. Just in a very general way, we heard Helen reacting to to her reaction to the research for her sectors. I know you started in the fashion sector. Yes, actually, this will be a little bit of a way to tell us a bit about your work, and now you work in the finance sector. But what's been your reaction to what you read?
Yeah, thanks, Helga. So yes, as you mentioned, I've kind of worked across a few different industries in my career so far. So I began my career in the fashion industry. I was there for a number of years before moving into consulting and currently financial services. And I think one thing that was really eye-opening, I suppose, when I read the research is just how fundamental this idea of social capital is across sectors, across industries, and particularly going into the fashion industry, it was clear that even from an entry-level position, we weren't all going into that experience with that same level of social capital. And often, you know, particularly coming from a minoritized group, you are playing catch-up a little bit in terms of wanting to be part of that club, wanting to get your foot in the door. And I think your comment earlier, Helga, around you know, the arts being a closed shop that thinks there's an open shop, within fashion, it's very much a closed shop that wants to be a closed shop. So there was a lot to navigate in terms of, you know, trying to I suppose enter such an exclusive world. But I think, yeah, it was very interesting to see how you know, particularly from the respondents, a lot of the same sort of themes that I'm seeing now working with women within financial services, and also my earlier experiences within fashion. It really does, it reflects quite accurately.
Thank you. And Andy, you and I have worked together in various sectors, and particularly with more recently with me in the arts, but we did some work that Network Ability is based on in the legal and professional sector. But now you work predominantly, I guess, across major corporates. What was your reaction to some of the ideas in the research?
Well, there were a few things. I mean, I thought it's a really nice piece of work, by the way, and I'm not just saying that because we're friends. The first, when you often with these qualitative pieces of work, you get is a list of kind of interesting quotes, and then somebody bolts a bit of theory on, and there's not really a connection between the two. But in this case, I think it's partly from, as Helen was saying, you've got very deep insights. You went deep with people, and the Bourdieu, which was new to me, but really seemed to fit. So that's quite unusual, I think, in that kind of research design. So I thought that was really insightful. And I found a lot of although the respondents were talking about their own fairly idiosyncratic backgrounds, and I felt there was a universality actually about the kinds of experiences they were talking about. They were very easy for me, as a grey-haired, middle-aged white guy to still kind of understand where people were coming from and to relate. I think about my own experiences as a former academic. I was a lecturer at Aston in the 90s, then moving into the business world with no business social capital to speak about, which is where I had to learn about networking. And my business partner at the time, Paul Klusker, you know well, said, we've got to get into networking. And I was like, no, there's no way we're doing that. It's false. It's superficial. It lacks authenticity. all that was, of course, rationalization. And the truth was I was just frightened of going into these places and meeting different kinds of people. So I kind of related to all of that, even though I'm probably not somebody that you would have called as a respondent, you know, as a participant.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I remember one of the reasons that we wrote Networkability, and I think this now, and as in now I've discovered Bourdieu, I can see this as a habitus thing. I remember you telling me ages ago that you had a kind of blue chip, you had a blue chip interview somewhere like Shell or ICI, somewhere really big.
Yeah, it was,
and that
it was BP.
It was BP, yeah. So you'd done really well on the interview, and then they said, "Oh, and just would you like to go and see the? Was it that? Well, I'll let you tell it. Didn't they ask you? Ask you if they wanted to go? You wanted to go somewhere and see the facility or something that you had to do."
No, I turned up and I'd been told, this was the sort of naivety, I'd been told that I had to just meet a project manager, and my appointment as a very well-paid executive coach, as it was going to be, was just a formality. Just meet this project manager, it's just a formality. So that was the first naive mistake. And I turned up at the reception, and this woman met me, and we had a long walk to the interview room, and I just couldn't keep the conversation going. I sort of, you know, I walked quietly to the place, did my interview and left. It was completely hopeless because I didn't understand at all what was going on.
Yeah.
And I probably only realized two years later.
So I think that, you know, that really that's habitus. It's like, that might have been all sorts of received ideas you had about meeting strangers, not being, you know, not putting yourself out there too much. And also, as you say, just lacking the skills to make that. So I think that's one of the things I now in hindsight see sort of links the earlier work we did, which was very much skills based, to this slightly bigger picture. Tosin, talent in these networks, so networks for you, or that you have in your own experience or that you've seen elsewhere, why do they matter, or what's their importance for you? And particularly when working with diverse workforces, how does that play out?
Yeah, I think it kind of ties really nicely into the research around sort of the bonding ties and the bridging ties. And I think particularly networks and the function they play kind of within organizations or industries, particularly for minoritized groups, it's this sense of representation and those authentic value-based connections, as opposed to necessarily just focusing on the status. And really that's seen leads to that greater job satisfaction when you're able to find your I guess your place within kind of the structure of an organization, and you know, that really plays into that authenticity and being able to, you know, show up as yourself, because I suppose so much of, you know, a lot of people's experience within the corporate world, any kind of professional setting, is about that, you know, assimilation that we've talked a lot about. But yeah, I think those bonding ties that come from networks are so fundamental.
Helen, in terms of the academic networks, are obviously, you know, like they're very lauded, aren't they? They are. People are often talking about, you know, the collaboration and one bit of learning building on another. Although I think it's fair to say that I've been much more practically minded about, at one point when I'd done the literature review and I said, well, what do I do now? Helen said, well, you can disagree with some of the other people who've written about things, and you can dispute their, and I just looked at her and went, why would I want to do that? Don't we want to try and get something practical out of this? So I think that is where I am not an academic. I'm much more practically minded. But the importance of networks in academia is massive, I would have thought.
Yeah, I think the importance of networks, but also the importance of coaching and the coaching mindset. So I did a piece of work on why coaching was appropriate in an academic setting. You have to remember that if you're an academic, you don't think you're managed, you think you're self-employed. Well, at least for 3 weeks of the month, and then you remember who pays you. I can see that Andy is smiling and remembering his previous existence. he's a recovered academic.
Yes, a recovering
right.
academic. Well, he was a recovering
Yeah.
one when I first met him. Maybe he's recovered now.
Yeah. And actually, so you, and the relationship, particularly the line management relationship, you can't tell an academic what to do. So actually, using coaching where you're able to persuade them that they actually made the decision. Well, they do have to make the decision in coaching, is actually very powerful. And but I do think that there's a less positive side of academic networks, which is still, as Tosin has said, the closed shop. It's very much who you know,
Really?
and who you collaborate with, and I think my learning from your piece of work is how could we break that down a bit more in academia?
Yeah. Andy, in your books, which you handily have behind you, Committed Action, Start With What Works, and the original one that you did, well, not your first one, but the one you and I did, Networkability. But in Start With What Works and Committed Action, you do talk about talent management. You know, has thinking about some of the ideas in the research, has that added to any of your thoughts about talent management and a sort of coaching approach?
Well, it's interesting actually, just reflecting on what Helen said about managing academics, because I sort of a corollary, maybe it's a corollary. I talk about the leader as educator, in the sense of bit of drawing out from people rather than, you know, doing to them to get them to do things. And so obviously that's very congruent with a coaching approach, and it kind of relates, I think, in a nice way to the superpowers idea as well. You know, if you start as a coach with the idea that your client has superpowers, they may not know them yet, or you know, some inner resources of which they are not yet as aware as they could be. And also it also links with that notion of being more ambitious. I sometimes say I'm more ambitious for my client than they are for themselves, which again I think is what a good, you know, a coach, or it's a very classic sort of hero's journey thing, isn't it? That the mentor sees something in the hero, and brings that out. So that's kind of, you know, a lot of my thinking about organizations comes from my idea about how I think about motivation, which is that you can't motivate people. Probably because I grew up in a university, Helen. But what you can do is you can recognize that they are motivated, and that if you can find ways to draw on that motivation. And I think if you start there, a lot of one's approach to talent and all those sort of traditional areas of organizational behavior, organizational development come from there. It creates a certain ethos, a certain way of working with people. Has Helga frozen?
I think we've lost Helga.
I didn't stun her into silence there, did I?
No, I think she's got her bandwidth. She's doing fantastically. Are you back, Helga?
I felt like I never went away, but clearly I was gone. I'm so sorry. So I was going to move to Tosin. We talked about the superpowers bit, but actually in Anissa's response, and I do take her point. She's like, she wanted to be a bit cautious about that, to not feel like minoritized people had to be extra. And I think it's a discussion that sometimes happens with the Paralympians. It's like they're not superheroes. They're just, you know, they're just incredibly gifted. No, we don't have to have this hero narrative about people. I think superpowers came out of particularly some of the people who were talking about. I suppose I just wanted to say, a lot of people who had a habitus that the majority culture might not disdain or pity or really look at from this deficit model, actually, they were doing really fine. I don't know. So where are you? What was it about the sort of innate strengths and embodied learning that resonated for you?
Yeah, I think I can really see that in my own lived experience. You know, as a minoritized person, I'm, you know, from a West African kind of cultural background and a first generation immigrant. I think that in itself, that habitus, I suppose, really has shaped my approach to careers, to studying, to all of these things. And I think, yeah, the idea of having to be exceptional was sort of planted quite early on, I think, and probably not consciously or explicitly, but it was, you know, like someone in the research said, this idea that you have to be, you know, twice as good to, you know, to level up with your counterparts. And yeah, that's something that I've had to work through and unpick, and coaching has really helped me to do so. And I definitely relate to Anissa's point around, you know, we want to be cautious about that, because, you know, it plays into a lot of tropes, particularly, you know, this idea of the strong Black woman, and this idea that we have to live and breathe our trauma because it makes us strong and we can handle anything. And I think that can be a really damaging stereotype, particularly in the workplace, when you see, you know, this expectation that, you know, particularly women of color are just stronger. You know, we see it in healthcare where there's this assumption that Black mothers have a higher pain threshold and things like that. So I guess it is very important to really examine the language that we use there. But I can absolutely see where that comes from in my lived experience, and you know, how that came through in the research.
I'm just picking up on some of the Q&As. There's one from Deb's right here that says, I'm interested in Anissa's comments on the extraordinary narrative. Could the panel expand on their own views of minorities being seen to be either not visible or superhuman? And I suppose that's what I take that note of caution. I suppose what I wanted to say was, it's a bit stark in the version I sent you, but in the full research, what comes out is that through the coaching, people get to own bits of their narrative and use it in a way that works for them. So it isn't that they constantly have to be, you know, I am Superman, or I am, you know, you know, with great power comes great responsibility, I'm Spider-Man. But that people, and also, but actually quite strategically, people were using bits of their own narrative to forward their aims, or to tell the story of their values. But yes, but that's part of this dismantling, that systemic issue of you're either invisible or, you know, like the only way you exist is to be a certain way. I think is all part of that systemic thing that needs unpicking. Helen or Andy, do you want to add anything else about that sort of extraordinary narrative?
Helen?
You start while I think of something.
I certainly can't comment about it from the point of view of someone who's minoritized. I've not had that experience. I might, I mean, there've been times when I might have been in a small way, but not in the, you know, so I'm not going to try and, but I do think that that issue for, you know, whether to fit in or whether to hang back or to stand out, or when to fit in, when not to fit in, it's whether one is special in one's life or is. I've got an opportunity to do a Zen quote, so I have to take it, right? So Shunryu Suzuki in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind says, to a mother with children, having children is nothing special. And I think there's something in that it is, you know, we are special and we're not special, right? And I think that's what I was saying about the universality of some of the things that I felt reading the research, even beyond the specific context that you were researching in, that are really interesting.
And I suppose I would add, it's about storytelling. So we are all a story, and we're not just, we're minoritized or we're unminoritized, or we're from a different group, or that we have a certain disability. We're actually a story, and to see yourself as someone who is this living narrative, I think is much more constructive. And I think in higher education, where we're trying to help usually young people to find their own voice and their own space in a way that makes them comfortable and yet understand the structures and the previous story. I think that's the fascinating thing for me. I think it's more organic.
We have another question about the extraordinary narrative from Bobby, and I have to say, whether it includes a piece of a term I've not heard before, so I'm going to read it out, and then this is a free for anybody.
So you've gone into your parallel universe as you again, Helga, as you read these out. So maybe you'd like to read it again.
Okay, sorry. Yes, am I back?
Yes, sorry, you're back.
I'm back. With the extraordinary narrative in mind and the extra effort required for success in a minoritizing context, how do you think the impact of weathering, as in weathering, weathering, and I dislike this phrase as I think it's a bit patronizing, can be mitigated in coaching and beyond? I'm afraid, Helen, you were nodding as I said weathering, but I haven't come across the term. So perhaps if someone can enlighten me on this, we can answer the question.
Well, I've come across it in the as weathering is going through bad weather, experiencing,
right?
But maybe I'm defining it wrong.
Oh, so the idea that you just have these are just crappy experiences you have to put up with
going on, and well, we had to do it like that in our day. So build up your experience, get your backbone sorted out.
Yeah,
but maybe I'm interpreting it wrong.
If we are, Bobby, jump on the chat and let us know. Can it be mitigated? I'm not. I think certainly when I was a lawyer, that was absolutely for women, the women partners. No, I shouldn't say there were some who were great, but there were some women partners who went, went through hell to get here. Is it? Have I gone again?
Yeah, you disappeared again.
Yeah, sorry. Tosin, have you got? Is that? I don't know how much you heard about when I was in the law sector. Sometimes female partners would just expect you to have to go through something similar. What's the situation in the financial sector? My sense is it's changed there, or am I being naive?
Yes, I think it's definitely moved along. Probably in the last sort of 10, 15 years. But I think there is still a little bit of that same mentality, like, particularly when we've got such a multi-generational workforce, this idea that, well, I went through this, so should you, or you've got it so easy, back when I first started out at XYZ. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of that, but I think there is a more conscious effort now to, allow everyone to kind of to rise up and to move beyond, maybe what other people have weathered. But I think that tension definitely still exists from a sort of an intergenerational perspective in financial services.
So Bobby has written, weathering, the process of wearing or being worn by long exposure to the atmosphere, damage to the confidence, well-being done over time by persistent microaggressions, discrimination, etc. I'm going to move on if that's okay, because I think in part I think in part this another question is going to help towards that, and that's because to me part of the answer is about allyship, specifically anti-racist practices, and in particular being sensitive to the structures and power that's at play. And I have a question from Carolyn Didsbury. Big shout out. She's actually my coaching supervisor, or has been. So thank you very much, Carolyn, for coming. But she's saying, how effective do you think a majoritized coach can be when working with a minoritized client? And I'm just going to say something briefly, and I invite you all to. I think there is definitely there's a value to somebody sharing the same lived experience as someone else, but it's not obligatory. I think there's a certain there's a certain experience, and Tosin, I'll be interested in your take on this. I think there's a certain perspective that you get, but actually one of the participants had a really trenchant and very, very prescient piece of coaching that absolutely turned her life around in terms of her perception of race. And I just assumed that coach was going to be a black man, and he wasn't. He was actually a very posh white man. So I just think, so I think for me, I think there's a place for that, absolutely. But wherever you are as a coach, being alive to the power structures, both as between you and your coachee, and just even being sensitive to that, you know, are they going along with this just because I said it? And if particularly if a minoritized person is working in a workplace, not automatically thinking that their deal is going to be the same as that them petitioning for something and being turned down, it is being turned down for the same reasons that you might be turned down or might not be turned down. I don't know, what are other people's feelings about that? Tosin.
Shall I kick off?
Oh yes, certainly.
So of course, when you're a coach, you learn more from the coachee than you do they learn from you, or perhaps not more, but you learn a great deal. And so I think to be able to coach people from a range of backgrounds is a privilege, and really helps understand how other people's lived experience and their habitats. And I think that's incredibly useful as a coach.
Yeah. So even just being aware of the privilege of understanding somebody's life experience. Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. I think, you know, all effective coaches are leading with curiosity and being able to, you know, essentially help the coachee uncover blind spots or, you know, limitations in their thinking. And I think that does, you know, really transcend kind of the habitus and maybe having to share the same lived experience. And, you know, I've had, you know, really moving experiences within coaching with coaches who are from a completely different background as me. And I think that, yes, there is absolutely a sense of understanding when you're working with someone who has a kind of that same lived experience. But I still think coaching as a practice is so effective when done right, regardless of kind of the shared background. It's about kind of the curiosity and asking the right questions and you know, building that trust.
Yeah. Andy, anything to add on that?
I'm sure that people can be successfully coached both ways round, actually. Yeah. And but I'm sure there'll also be times when those things don't work very well. And I think the success of coaching, sometimes it's a matter of, I think really good coaching it's very idiosyncratic. So you might hear something from somebody that you just happen to really be ready to hear, and it could be from any, it could come from any sort of source. And sometimes you'll hear something, and 2 years later it's relevant. You know, so I think I think yes, the short answer to is yes, it can, but it won't necessarily work.
We're very nearly at the end. There's one question that's remained unanswered, and I'm just going to address briefly in order to address it. It kind of didn't fall so squarely into the research, but it was one of the first people who asked. An anonymous attendee said, I think a number of us may have been accused, in inverted commas, of playing on our identities, especially under this current government. How did these attacks against identity politics play into this? I think in short, I don't have a big answer. I think in short, this is any attack on identity politics is part of that as I say, maybe prevailing majority culture that this work is seeking to counteract, and that by equipping leaders with that sense of habitus, that sense of authenticity, I think in a way that's all we can do until, because we need to get people available to dismantle the structures. And I think this, and again, there's a, you know, it's kind of beyond the scope of my research anyway. It's like, what's the best way to do that? Do you build alliances from outside? You know, there's a well-known phrasal saying involving tents and pissing that I could probably evoke at this point, but I can't, you know, we've literally got 2 minutes to go, so I really don't want to, I can't get it. So I'm sorry we didn't perhaps give that a bit more airtime, but it was a bit tricky in the context. Just for last words, what gives you hope? You know, maybe just one sentence of what gives you hope for the future in terms of developing diverse leaders, in terms of creating something like habit, you know, oh, sorry, somebody talks like today give us hope. So thank you very much, Aurelia. But what gives you hope in terms of looking at this work, in terms of developing individuals? What you know, it can be particularly working in EDI generally is like, it's a long haul. So what can give us hope in the long haul? Who'd like to start?
Well, there's a lot more of it going around than there was when I
There's
started.
a lot of it about. Yes.
There's a lot of it about. Yes.
Yes. But yes,
and it is of a, you know, it's the discussion is nuanced, right? Yeah. Which I think is a stage in its evolution, maturity, which I think is good, very good.
Yeah, and I think, and I certainly hope that habitus is one of those things that can add this nuance as well. It's like and it might be a way that, it's not, oh, I found it now, but you know, but it certainly it could be a way in that people will find approachable or doable. Thank you, and thanks so much, Andy. Tosin.
I think very much like what Anissa mentioned in her video, I think the next generation give me a lot of hope. You know, I think they're a lot more vocal and willing to really demand the change they want to see, and have that kind of energy and vigor for it. So that really is encouraging. I work a lot with young people in the work that I do, and I think I take a lot of hope from how fearless they are compared to maybe my generation and previous.
Yeah, going in for those conversations certainly, yeah, seems what to be needed. Helen.
I suppose I go back to what we started with at the beginning of this session. I think it's great to be able to work across sectors and across different areas of practice. So the academic, the arts and the coaching coming together. And it's been a privilege working with you and getting to know a bit about that life a bit more, the arts life and the consulting life, and talking about coaching. I think we coached each other, didn't we, as we went along?
Very certainly, yes, certainly as I was doing those bleeding ethics forms, definitely. I think what gives me hope is that, I think I see that people are interested and wanting to engage. I think there's some fear for some people around saying or doing the wrong thing. There's some fear around, not knowing how to approach this. And I think we need to make spaces where we can have the more difficult conversations. And I think, as you say, Andy, there's more people who seem to be willing to want to make this happen. I count you all as panelists among those people. And everybody who's come here today, thank you so much. We're just running a couple of minutes over, but I just want to, before we finish, thank our speakers, thank Andy, thank Tosin, thank Helen, thank our live captioner, Maria. You've done, I know you'll have done a fantastic job. Gareth Peel, our producer, as ever, makes everything look lovely. Big thanks to Thomasina Carlisle, who has done my marketing for many years and has promoted this, and to Lara Ratnaraja, the ant to my deck of culturally diverse leadership. lager, two halves of lager, which was just a brilliant phrase. The other half of lager. Thank you very much for being on the Q&A. That's it for the research. Henry.com. See you soon. Thanks and bye-bye.